Hey guys, and welcome to another video. In today's video, I'm going to be giving you some of my thoughts about this trilogy. It is the Third Reich trilogy by Richard J. Evans. In case you didn't know, the first book in the trilogy is The Coming of the Third Reich. He then follows that up with The Third Reich in Power, and then the final book is The Third Reich at War. This is designed principally to be a history of the Third Reich, to give you an idea of both what the Third Reich was, why it happened, and what actually happened there. But it's designed for a modern 21st century English reader. And that's important to note, because he's not designing it for a history specialist audience, like he would write an academic paper to do that. He's also not writing it for a 20th century audience who are closer to the Third Reich. He has to explain certain things in here that someone living in the 1950s wouldn't have had to explain. And there's also much more updated research in the 21st century, so we know a lot more about what happened. Now, some of the choices he makes in here, specifically in the language he uses, I think is important, because what it does is it removes what I think that the way we think about the Third Reich in a lot of modern, just in our modern world, is we look at it as something other, something that happened to the German people back then that could never happen to us. And I want to be careful here. I don't want to sit here and say, oh, the second Hitler is coming to take over America or the UK or whatever. But the way he writes this book shows you that this wasn't an alien thing, that it was not quite as dramatic, I think, as a lot of people might want it to have been, and certainly not what a lot of people think it was. Hitler and his ideas were a lot more normal, I think, than a lot of people actually realize. And he goes into this a lot in the first book. So The Coming of the Third Reich, I do have a whole separate video on this. I'll put it up. I think it's up there. The Coming of the Third Reich, he talks about how Hitler and Hitler's ideas, such as anti-Semitism, pan-Germanism, and nationalism, were very much widespread through the whole of German society. And I think that this is an important thing, is that the extreme beliefs that Hitler held and that the Nazis held weren't some fringe ideas that were on the sort of edge of polite society. They were very much ideas that were maybe distasteful, maybe people didn't want to admit to them, but they were not shunned for those ideas. They were shunned for the violence and the way they pressed those ideas upon others. The ideas themselves, I don't think, were quite as shunned as what people would like to believe. And he does a really good job in The Coming of the Third Reich to show that. Now, Coming of the Third Reich sort of takes you from, he starts with Bismarck in a big way, but he explains a little bit of the background to Bismarck as well. For those who don't know, the Third Reich is named the Third Reich because the First Reich is the German, the Holy Roman Empire, which is kind of a German-centered thing. Then the Second Reich is Bismarck's Reich, which starts in 1871, and then they created the Third Reich, kind of in the spirit of those strong empires, if you will. And so in this first book, he tries to explain why the Third Reich happened, and his answer basically is that you have this anti-Semitism, this nationalism, and these right-wing ideas coming up within Germany. You also have quite radical left-wing ideas. Specifically after the First World War, you start to have these left-wing ideas coming out of Russia, where obviously the Russian Revolution happens, and you have that Bolshevism coming, and so you get this polarization. and it's a very violent polarization. You also, a lot of the Germans feel like there's a stab in the back myth where they feel like someone lost the First World War for them, and they actually didn't lose the war. And then this Weimar democracy gets placed on Germany. And nobody feels like the Weimar democracy is legitimate. They don't feel like it's a legitimate representation of the power of the state. And so they feel that Germany is one thing, the Weimar democracy is something else, and the Weimar democracy is not legitimate. And so inevitably, I think, at least what he seems to be saying here is that inevitably the Weimar Republic was unstable, and so something was probably going to happen, though he's very careful to show that it wasn't necessarily the Nazis. Although we now see that all these things led to the Nazis, it's very easy to look at like a point in 1890 and say, okay, well, at this point, then from then on, like, we can see that the Nazis were going to happen. You can't do that. And he's very careful not to do that in this book. Regardless, you end this book in 1933 when Hitler becomes Chancellor and then leader of Germany when Paul von Hindenburg dies. We then move on to the Third Reich in Power and the Third Reich at War. These are very different books to the coming of the Third Reich. These books are much more descriptive of what the Third Reich was like. They're not answering a question like, how did the Nazis come to power? In these books, this one is split into, I think, 7 sections, and they deal with like culture, they deal with education, they deal with religion and sort of spiritual ideas within the Third Reich. It's one on the economy. There's like, so basically he's doing a description of how the Third Reich worked, specifically in here how Hitler managed to turn Germany into Nazi Germany. And so you see like a lot of the repression, how the Nazi state was everywhere. It ended up being everywhere within the Third Reich. And so it's a fascinating description of it. It is designed to be read as a single book, but you can, like, I think, read like specific chapters if you're interested in certain things. And in here you start to get that anti-Semitism coming through. I mean, it's present from the very beginning, but I think that what we see as the Third Reich is the concentration camps. I think in the 21st century, certainly in Australia where I live and probably other places in the world, we see the Third Reich as being the concentration camps and that being the defining feature. And while I don't think you can ignore it, there's a lot more to the Third Reich that was horrible that we shouldn't forget. Things like from day dot, they were planning to go to war, and so they were cutting off their trade relations with other countries and trying to create an autarky so that they could produce everything they needed by themselves, but they couldn't do it. And so people starved. There wasn't enough food to go around. Like things like this that we don't necessarily think about. So even the Aryans, the people who were not being oppressed by the Nazis, were very much being oppressed by the Nazis. And I think we forget that. I think this is a good reminder of what happened there. The last book, The Third Reich at War, basically starts with I think the invasion of Czechoslovakia happens in here. In the final chapter, it's The Road to War, I believe it's called. It's called The Road to War. And you see the invasion of Czechoslovakia here, or the subjugation, I guess. And then the invasion of Poland happens at the outset of this book. This book is all about, it basically mirrors, like these two are mirrored in a way. This one's before the war, this one during the war. But yeah, basically it's explaining all the different ways the Third Reich operated during the war, how they produced the stuff they needed for the war, how was military planning undertaken, how was the how the propaganda worked, and then in a big way, it's about the concentration camps. But not just the concentration camps for the Jews, the concentration camps for prisoners of war, political prisoners, and then he deals in here specifically with the question of, did the Germans know what was going on? And he says, like, yes, basically it's obvious. There's a lot of diary entries that we know of that talk about the concentration camps and what was going on. He talks about how the Germans felt about where they were living. And then he also talks about the resistance to Hitler and how the idea of the Third Reich, the idea of Nazi Germany, the idea of the leader of Hitler crumbled over time, specifically when you start having the bombings. And I've been reading Lawrence Rees's Hitler and Stalin, and there's an interesting little snippet in there about the Soviet army marching into Poland and finding out that the Poles lived a lot better than they did, despite the propaganda and what they had been told, and they couldn't understand why. But even though they were seeing it with their own eyes, they couldn't believe it. And in a way, he tackles this question with regard to the ordinary Germans as well, in saying, like, looking at how they tried to cling on to the idea of Hitler being what they thought he was, even though they were living in a city that was being firebombed and there's these massive firestorms, and Hitler clearly doesn't know what he's doing. And so that struggle of someone who's grown up in Nazi Germany and believes what they've been told, and then in a very shocking way being shown that it wasn't true. And then the book ends very quickly with Hitler's death and just like a slight little conclusion. Evans doesn't beat around the bush. He doesn't go on for like the next 20 years and show you where all of them ended up. He does what he says he's going to do. He tells you how the Nazis came to power, what it was like when they were in power, and then how the war was fought in Nazi Germany, and then that's that. In terms of who I think should read this book, look, if you're interested, it's 2,000 pages long. It's very interesting, but it might be a little bit much if you just got a casual interest in Nazi Germany. It is tough going. This is not a nice subject to read about. Specifically when you start like hearing about the cruelty of like the medical experiments that were going on in the concentration camps and all of those things, it's not fun to read about. If you just like sort of want to be conversationally also like have a working knowledge of Nazi Germany, like this is a good way to do it. Like you're not going to you're not going to miss anything, right? You're going to know all the points, but you're not going to know any of the points in a huge amount of depth. You can read other books to get that, right? Like this isn't trying to give you everything in a huge amount of depth. It's just trying to introduce you to everything there is about Nazi Germany in at least a little bit of detail. Like you might have a few pages on the symphonies in Munich, right? Like there might be a page or two on that, but you're not going to get heaps of detail. You can go and find that information somewhere else, but at least you sort of get a broad overview in here. So that's that. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.